The acting attorney general fired by President Trump lays out what she told the White House about the president's first national security advisor and Russia. This is Special Report. Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Bret Baier. A former Justice Department lawyer fired by President Trump says she tried to warn the incoming administration about General Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, saying he could be possibly blackmailed by the Russians. She told her story today for the first time on Capitol Hill. President Trump issued a prebuttal before Sally Yates ever took the stand and tried to deflect blame onto Yates and President Obama. How information leaked, who leaked it, the unmasking of names, and the question about collusion, all covered today in the hearing. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge was at that hearing. She joins us now from Capitol Hill. Good evening, Catherine. Well,
thank you, Brett. The hearing wrapped here on Capitol Hill just 15 minutes ago with the former acting attorney general testifying that she warned the White House counsel multiple times about Flynn and the potential for blackmail.
We felt like it was critical that we get this information to the White House.
Testifying before a Senate committee, Obama administration appointee Sally Yates broke her silence.
Because the vice president was unknowingly making false statements to the public.
The former acting attorney general testified that she met twice in person and had a phone call with the White House counsel Don McGahn because the White House said the incoming national security advisor Mike Flynn did not discuss sanctions in late December with the Russian ambassador, when intelligence transcripts showed the opposite.
Not only did we believe that the Russians knew this, but that they likely had proof of this information. And that created a compromise situation, a situation where the national security advisor essentially could be blackmailed by the Russians.
And Yates, who would later lose her job for refusing to back the Trump travel ban, said the Justice Department felt the Flynn situation was serious.
We told them that we were giving them all of this information so that they could take action.
Pressed on whether then President Obama also warned President-elect Trump not to hire Flynn, the White House spokesman said,
President Obama made it known that he wasn't exactly a fan of General Flynn's, which is frankly shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, that given that General Flynn had worked for President Obama, was an outspoken critic of President Obama's shortcomings.
And Spicer reinforced this presidential tweet that the Obama administration gave Flynn the highest security clearance.
So if President Obama or anyone else, frankly, in the government was concerned, the question should be asked, what did they do? And if nothing, then why not, if they really truly were concerned?
And another tweet about how classified information got into the media after Yates briefed the White House.
The tweet speaks for itself. What he's saying is that the Senate should ask those questions.
Have either of you ever been an anonymous source in a news report about matters relating to Mr. Trump, his associates, or Russians' attempt to meddle in the election?
No. Absolutely not.
Both witnesses confirmed that members of the Trump team were identified or unmasked in intelligence reports.
Did either of you ever review classified documents in which Mr. Trump, his associates, or members of Congress had been unmasked?
Oh, yes.
You have. Can you give us details here in this?
No, I can't.
Ms. Yates, have you?
Yes, I have, and no, I can't give you details.
The former director of national intelligence was pressed on his conclusion that there was no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Moscow. Clapper seemed to qualify the statement.
I was not aware of the counterintelligence investigation Director Comey first referred to during his testimony before the House Permanent Select Committee for Intelligence on the 20th of March.
Flynn resigned in mid-February, 18 days after Yates' warning, but neither witness could explain today whether the White House blocked Flynn's access to classified information or barred him from national security discussions. Brett.
Catherine, thank you. Let's talk about what we heard this afternoon. Senior political analyst Bret Hume joins us tonight here on set. Good evening, Brett.
Hi, Brett. Nice to see you.
Your thoughts about today?
Well, I don't think we learned a great deal that's new. I mean, the big takeaway to me was after we heard this, after we heard what the Justice Department had seen about General Flynn and could see that he was lying about the extent of his discussions with the Russians and warned the administration about that. And my takeaway was, well, they better get rid of Flynn. Oh, wait. Flynn
gone.
Flynn was long gone. Now, there'll probably be discussion out of this, Brett, about why it took them, 18 days or something after the warnings were issued for him to be gone. But in the end, what she said, Sally Yates said about Flynn was that he was lying to the administration and lied to the vice president. And that's what he got fired for. So I just don't think as a political matter that revelation that it, or the view that it took too long is going to make much difference, since he's gone and indeed long gone.
Clearly, you can hear from the questioning by Senate Democrats that they believe that this story has a lot of legs, and that we are just at the tip of the iceberg of what they think is going to lead them to collusion, even though we don't have any evidence of that from the intelligence officials.
Well, we don't, and Clapper was asked today if he still stood by his conclusion given toward the end of the Obama administration before he left, based on work that had been done by all the intelligence agencies, that there was no evidence of collusion. He said he stood by that. Sally Yates said she couldn't say because it was classified. There was an awful lot that both witnesses couldn't say because it was classified, which tells us nothing. And she repeatedly said, don't infer anything from the fact that I can't talk about this. That doesn't mean the answer is yes, doesn't mean the answer is no. So it didn't really move the ball very much. Embarrassing, obviously, to have been so close to this guy who looks like he exercised very bad judgment. I'm talking about Flynn. But it didn't advance the ball very much on the unmasking, and it didn't advance the ball very much and it didn't advance the ball at all on collusion between Russia and the Trump team.
Two more things. If the Washington Post doesn't do the story, getting leaked information about Flynn on that call,
right,
does Michael Flynn, is he still National Security Advisor?
That's a very good question, Brett. We'll probably never know the answer to that. We do know that the sequence of events suggests that the Post, what happened is she issues the warnings to the White House counsel. Some days thereafter, word of the warnings leaks and gets into the press. It shouldn't have, but it did. And the next thing you know, Flynn is gone. So you can make the case that it looks like they wouldn't have fired him if it hadn't leaked out, but we don't know that. And then the bottom line is he's gone.
Last thing, she was fired for not going forward with the executive order, for standing up against the travel ban executive order. She was pressed on that a couple of times today.
Yeah, she was, and she handled it pretty well. She she made basically the essential arguments that people who are opposed to the travel ban and judges who have ruled against it have made, and she held her own very well. It is nonetheless very unusual for an attorney general, especially an acting attorney general, to refuse to represent the government's position on a particular matter, particularly when the Office of Legal Counsel, which gives a preliminary judgment on the constitutionality or legality of executive orders, has ruled that this one was okay. So people will be arguing about that forever. But I don't think it's not a lasting matter.
How long do you think it'll take before we hear some Democrats say Sally Yates should run for office?
I think in the pantheon of liberal heroes, she's right up there tonight, and she conducted herself, I thought, with some. I heard complaints that I saw on my Twitter feed and elsewhere, people saying she was partisan. I don't think you can make a case for her partisanship based on today. I thought she conducted herself very ably.
Brett, as always, thank you. Good to have you back.
Thank you.
Another of President Trump's early moves that was short-circuited was argued today before the Circuit Court of Appeals, one rung below the Supreme Court. At issue is what we just talked about there, the Trump travel ban on citizens from Muslim-majority nations. Was it about religion or national security? Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen was in the courtroom today in Richmond.
Acting Solicitor General Jeffrey Wall argued President Trump's campaign statements and others since January 20 about Muslims and the meaning of his executive orders on immigration carry less legal weight than his near total authority over immigration policy and the purportedly neutral text of the second order.
The president clarified over time that what he was talking about were countries and territories that have known links to groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda.
Judge Pamela Harris, an Obama appointee, challenged Wall on how the order could be considered neutral in its operations when all of the targeted countries are majority Muslim.
What do you mean by neutral in operation? I mean, clearly the law has a disparate impact on Muslims.
Judge James Wynn, another Obama appointee, openly scoffed at the idea that President Trump's statements, especially one during the signing of the first executive order, saying we all know what that means, reflected no animus towards Muslims.
There is this affirmative duty to sort of look at if there's bad faith. and to determine in bad faith, don't we get to consider what was actually said here?
Omar Jadwat, representing the American Civil Liberties Union, argued Mr. Trump's prior statements must be considered and that the 6 targeted countries didn't even meet the administration's own tests for national security risk. But Jadwat was forced to admit that it is the president who is entrusted with national security determinations, and Judge Paul Niemeyer, a George H.W. Bush appointee, got Jadwat to admit that absent Mr. Trump's statements, the order might survive constitutionally.
If some other candidate had won the election and issued this executive order that's before us, I gather you would have no problem with that. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor. I think in that case it could be constitutional.
Where the acting Solicitor General was smooth in the face of often hostile questioning, the ACLU lawyer was tentative, halting, rebuked by 3 different judges for failing to answer their questions. Next week, the show goes on the road once more to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. But most analysts believe the final destination for this case is the Supreme Court. Brett?
James Rosen, live in Richmond. James, thanks. What do you think will happen to the travel ban? Let me know on Twitter, at Bret Baier. You can use the hashtag Special Report, or on Facebook at facebook.com/BretBaierSR. The president is working on getting his own judges into positions of power tonight. Correspondent Kevin Cork reports on a big step forward on that front. Good evening, Kevin.
Evening to you, Brett. The president with a chance now to shape American jurisprudence for many years to come, with the expected announcement of 10 nominees to the federal bench, including a pair that could someday occupy the highest court in the land. It was a list that was months in the making, but one the White House has been eager to reveal.
These 10 individuals that the president has chosen were chosen for their deep knowledge of the law and their commitment to upholding constitutional principles.
Fox News has learned that President Trump's first batch of judicial nominees contains 10 judges, including 2 candidates he previously floated for the Supreme Court, Judges Joan Larson and David Strauss. Larson, who currently sits on the Michigan Supreme Court, is being nominated for the 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Larson is also a former law clerk to the late Justice Antonin Scalia and delivered one of the tributes at his memorial service last year. Strauss is a judge on the Minnesota Supreme Court and previously clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas. He's also been tapped for the 8th Circuit. The judges set to fill some of the scores of openings on the federal bench. 129 vacancies, including 49 judicial emergencies, and over 100 openings at the district court level alone. The longest, a vacancy in the Eastern District of North Carolina that's been unfilled for 11 years.
We always think about the Supreme Court, but more than 99% of the cases are decided at the lower federal courts, at the appellate courts, or at the trial level. So these vacancies, the upwards of 120 vacancies, are very crucial. And President Trump recognized that.
It's expected that the president's nominees will be fast-tracked, thanks in part to a 2013 decision by former Democratic Senator from Nevada, Harry Reid, to end the filibuster for lower court nominees.
You are going to be amazed at the exceptionalness of them all. I mean, the qualifications are impeccable.
But even as the administration looks to fill key vacancies on the federal bench, there are still hundreds of administration posts that remain unfilled, including a number of positions at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
We've been tracking where we are. I think we're well on pace with where previous administrations have been. Some ahead, some a little behind. But we're doing a great job of filling those key positions and making sure that we get the right person for the right job.
Some ahead and some behind, indeed. By the way, Brett, we also learned today from the press secretary there, Sean Spicer, that the list of judicial nominees was created in consultation with the Heritage Foundation and the Conservative Federalist Society. One of the names on that list, by the way, Neil Gorsuch, who, of course, has since been confirmed to the High Court. Brett?
Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. Stocks were up slightly today. The Dow gained 5. The S&P 500 finished ahead a tenth. The Nasdaq inched up 2. Former President Obama is employing lawmakers to stand up for the sick and vulnerable. A veiled reference to a Republican-backed House bill to repeal and replace his health care reform initiative and law, Obamacare. The president made the comments as he was honored with a Profile and Courage Award at the Kennedy Center last night. He specifically talked about lawmakers who lost their seats over their votes for Obamacare.
It is my fervent hope, and the hope of millions, that regardless of party, such courage is still possible.
Mr. Obama made no direct reference to last week's vote, nor did he specifically mention President Trump. We will have more on the next steps on Capitol Hill for the repeal and replace effort by the Republicans with the panel. Idaho Republican Congressman Raul Labrador is admitting his statement that no one has died because they did not have access to health care was not very elegant. His exchange with a constituent occurred at a town hall event Friday.
You are mandating people on Medicaid except dying. You are making a
no one wants anybody to die. You know, that line is so indefensible. Nobody dies because they don't have access to health care.
Labrador released a statement the next day saying he rejects the argument that the health care reform bill passed last week by the House will cause people to die. Meantime, overseas, Afghanistan's Air Force is pounding ISIS targets following the death of the terror group's top commander in the region. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin is at the Pentagon tonight with specifics. Good evening, Jennifer.
Good evening, Brett. Coalition forces are currently undertaking a bombing campaign against ISIS in Nangarhar province, the part of eastern Afghanistan, where the Pentagon says it killed the Afghan head of ISIS, Sheikh Abdul Hasib Logari, on April 27th. The Afghan president's office confirmed the Pentagon announcement today in Kabul. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, en route to Denmark, had this to say about the fight against ISIS.
They're on their back foot in Syria. They're on their back foot in Iraq. They've lost a lot of ground. They still have strengths. In Nangarhar, we have eliminated the Emir, and so the fight goes on.
We've now learned that the 2 U.S. Army Rangers who were also killed on April 27th in eastern Afghanistan, Sergeant Joshua Rogers of Bloomington, Illinois, and Sergeant Cameron Thomas of Kettering, Ohio, were killed in the very same raid that killed the Afghan head of ISIS 2 weeks ago. The Pentagon is now investigating whether the 2 Americans were killed as a result of friendly fire. This is the same area where last month the U.S. dropped the mother of all bombs, a 21,000-pound bomb, which is the largest non-nuclear bomb in the Air Force's arsenal. That bomb was employed in the wake of a vicious ISIS attack on a hospital in Kabul that left 50 dead. Today, the Afghan president said Sheikh Abdul Hasib oversaw that hospital attack, but he is now dead. The top U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General John Nicholson, issued the following statement, quote, "Any ISIS member that comes to Afghanistan will meet the same fate." The Pentagon plans to present President Trump with a plan this week for Afghanistan that includes a request for about 3,000 more troops for Afghanistan. On Capitol Hill last week, the head of U.S. Special Operations Command, General Tony Thomas, suggested the new strategy could include more troops and changes to the rules of engagement. Brett.
Jennifer Griffin, live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis says he owes it to the people of Syria to take a close look at the Russian proposal to create safe zones there. The U.S. is not a party to the agreement between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. The zones went into effect over the weekend. Today, Syria's foreign minister dismissed the idea of most foreign forces patrolling the safe zone, suggesting only Russian military police would be acceptable. Up next, what's next for France and Europe after this weekend's big election? First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 5 in New York, as part of a seawall collapses into the East River right behind the mayor's residence. Officials are not sure what caused that collapse or when exactly it happened. In Chicago, as 6 people die and at least 26 are wounded in weekend shootings. The city passed the 1,000 mark for gunshot victims late last month. It is nearing the horrific 200 homicide milestone. That is according to data from the Chicago Sun-Times. And this is a live look at Austin, Texas from our affiliate Fox 7. The big story there tonight, Republican Governor Greg Abbott signs a so-called sanctuary cities ban. It lets police ask during routine stops whether someone is in the U.S. legally. Abbott signed the measure on Facebook Live Sunday evening without advance notice. Critics call the bill racist and divisive. There are currently no sanctuary cities in Texas. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. We now know who will be France's next president. Emmanuel Macron easily defeated Marine Le Pen yesterday. Tonight from Paris, senior foreign affairs correspondent Greg Palcott tells us what comes next.
A changing of the guard and more in France. Outgoing President Francois Hollande with President-elect Emmanuel Macron at a World War II commemoration in Paris. At 39, Macron is the youngest French leader since Napoleon Bonaparte. He has never held elected office.
It's unprecedented and unheard of, so we are in a new political era with a new political landscape which is shaping up.
Macron's performance at his victory celebration last night was quite professional, culminating a campaign that saw the former investment banker create his own party and a reform platform. He won with some 66% of the vote in the runoff election. His far-right rival Marine Le Pen got 34%.
I will do everything in the 5 years to come, so there is no more reason to vote for the extremes anymore.
Populist Le Pen did receive some 10.5 million votes, twice as much as her last presidential result. Her nationalist message played well in parts of the country hit hard by a stagnant economy and insecurity. And while analysts say her tough talk contributed to her loss, she went down swinging.
I call for all the patriots to join us in participating in the decisive political fight that is starting tonight.
Still, 1/3 of an unsettled French electorate voted for no one. This after rejecting the major parties in the first round. There were mixed reactions today about the Macron victory.
Do you think he'll do a good job?
I hope so. Il est jeune, on va gagner.
He's young, and he will win.
Yes. Oh, pas bien du tout.
No good. Why?
No good.
Why?
Oh, it's horrible.
Riots in a Paris neighborhood last night underscored the challenges Macron faces as he forms a government, fields candidates for legislative elections, and tries to get his reforms through. Outside of France, there was relief. Macron's pro-EU and pro-NATO stances reassuring a concerned international community. At upcoming summits, Macron gets to meet another outsider-turned leader, President Trump.
President Trump has tweeted that he looks forward to working with French President-elect Macron. Transitions are pretty fast here. The inauguration is set for next Sunday. Then the fun really begins. Brett.
Valgod live in Paris early Tuesday morning. Greg, thank you. Well, another major election. There could be a major shift in South Korea's politics this week. Voting is taking place right now in their presidential election, and it could bring about a big change. What is not changing is the North's continued insistence that the U.S. is behind a plot to overthrow leader Kim Jong-un. Correspondent Rich Edson has the latest from the State Department tonight.
4 American citizens are now imprisoned in North Korea. This weekend, the regime announced it arrested Kim Hak-song, the second academic detained in the past 2 weeks working with the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology, or PUST. In a statement to Fox News, the university says, quote, "We understand that this detention is related to an investigation into matters that are not connected in any way with the work of PUST. Detaining American citizens, flagrant violations of United Nations Security Council resolutions on nuclear weapons and missile development, and horrific treatment of its citizens. The Trump administration says North Korea is the United States' primary security challenge, and the U.S.'s most important regional ally is holding an election Tuesday that will reshape that relationship."
Who is the president who can confidently say what he has to say to the U.S., China, Japan, and North Korea?
In March, South Korea impeached and removed its president. Voters now select a replacement. Polls show Moon Jae-in is the frontrunner. He says sanctions alone are insufficient in addressing North Korea's nuclear program. He's pushing for direct negotiations with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un.
There will be new tensions in the U.S.-ROK alliance relationship that have not been there under conservative governments over the course of the past 8 or 9 years.
His more conservative opponents, like Ahn Chol-soo, a former physician and software entrepreneur, claim Moon is soft on North Korea. He and other conservatives also support a controversial missile defense system the United States has installed in South Korea. Moon has criticized the decision to allow the system's deployment and, in a recent book, wrote South Korea should learn to, quote, say no to the Americans.
It's going to be harder to reverse that decision based on the fact that it's already there. I think that's part of the reason why, in fact, the deployment was accelerated.
There are also considerations beyond the North Korean threat between the United States and South Korea. President Trump has called the 2012 free trade agreement between the two countries horrible and has threatened to either terminate or renegotiate it. It would be up to the next South Korean administration to take up that task. Brent?
Rich Edson, live at the State Department. Rich, thank you. A senior U.S. defense official says Iran test-fired a high-speed torpedo yesterday in the Strait of Hormuz. The weapon has a range of 6 miles and can travel at 250 miles an hour. Since the test occurred in Iran's territorial waters, it technically did not violate any international protocols. Iran last tested the torpedo in February of 2015. The Salvadoran national, whose conviction in a high-profile Washington murder case was overturned, has been deported. The conviction of Ingmar Guandiki for the 2010 killing of congressional intern Chandra Levy was thrown out after a jailhouse informant's testimony came under scrutiny. Prosecutors elected not to retry him. Guandiki is now in the custody of authorities in San Salvador. It could soon cost you more to cut the cord and go with streaming for your TV entertainment. Many local governments, believe it or not, throughout the country are considering a tax on services such as Netflix and Hulu. Correspondent Claudia Cowan reports to find out why. Follow the money.
Government officials don't produce shows for Hulu, Netflix, Amazon, and other streaming services, but that's not stopping some from looking at ways to tax them.
Local governments and their power to tax are like an amoeba. You squeeze them down one place, they pop out someplace else.
Consumer watchdogs are wary as cities argue they're losing money and need to get creative. According to analyst firm MoffettNathanson, cable and satellite companies lost more than 750,000 subscribers in the first 3 months of this year. 5 times more than during the same period last year, a trend that's meant a drop in utility taxes attached to cable bills. Glendale, California is among those considering increasing utility user taxes, which cover gas, electric, and telecom services, to make up for hundreds of thousands in lost revenue.
Not to tax you twice, but to allow that there is a consistent flow of revenue that pays for the services that you as a resident, as a business, as a visitor, expect from that local government.
Glendale is enlisting the help of cable and satellite providers to determine how such a streaming video tax might work, but critics fear a slippery slope when streaming video services are taxed like a gas or water bill.
If you allow a city to do that, you're setting a precedent where almost anything on the internet or maybe even off the internet could be considered a taxable under a utility tax, and that's very problematic for consumers.
Chicago learned that lesson after blazing the Netflix tax trail in 2015, imposing a 9% levy on digital entertainment and prompting a consumer uproar. Last year, Pennsylvania added a 6% tax on digital downloads to help close a $1.3 billion budget gap. And Alabama, Illinois, and Louisiana are considering the idea. As are many cities, including a dozen here in California, looking at ways to find new sources of revenue amid the cord-cutting trend. But consumer groups are threatening to sue, claiming this is a new tax that did not get voter approval as required by law. Stay tuned. Brett?
We will. Claudia, thank you. The Air Force's secret spacecraft made quite an entrance in Florida yesterday. The unmanned X-37B landed at the Kennedy Space Center after 718 days in orbit. There were reports of a sonic boom that rattled the central part of the state, all the way to Tampa and Fort Myers. The Air Force does not exactly say what the spacecraft does. This was the ship's first landing in Florida. Sally Yates says she warned the Trump team about National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. We'll get reaction to her day of testimony up on Capitol Hill when the panel joins me after a break.
We felt like the vice president was entitled to know that the information he had been given and that he was relaying to the American public wasn't true. And that created a compromise situation, a situation where the national security advisor essentially could be blackmailed by the Russians. We told them that we were giving them all of this information so that they could take action, the action that they deemed appropriate.
Sally Yates, she was the acting attorney general until she was fired by President Trump over the executive order on the travel ban and not moving forward with that, defending it. She's talking about warning the White House counsel about Michael Flynn, the national security advisor at the time. There you see December 29th, the Obama administration announcing sanctions against Russia. You have Flynn speaking with the Russian ambassador multiple times that day. January 26th, Sally Yates warns the White House counsel, Don McGahn, about Flynn lying and saying that could potentially compromise him. February 8th, Flynn denies discussing the sanctions with Russian officials in a Washington Post piece. He then has to say he has no recollection of discussing sanctions. February 13th, Flynn resigns from his National Security Advisor post. That's where we are. Testimony today, a long hearing. Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief for the Weekly Standard. Mercedes Schlapp, columnist for the Washington Times. Anna Palmer, senior Washington correspondent for Politico, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Okay, Steve, thoughts on the day?
Well, what we need most in all of this discussion that we've been having now for 5+ months is new information. We need something to break through. We need some clarity on what's happening. We didn't get that today. I think what we got was more of the same. Mike Flynn made mistakes, exercised bad judgment. But on question after question, both James Clapper and Sally Yates hid behind classification. One would hope that if this matter continues, and we're certain that it will, somebody somewhere will say, we need to see this stuff. The American public needs to see this stuff. Whether you're talking about the transcripts of what Mike Flynn said in his conversation with Sergei Kislyak, whether you're talking about requests for unmasking, all of these things that are being debated without the benefit of the public seeing what's actually the substantive claims being made.
One thing we did learn, the New York Times had a piece in which they said the former president, as he was president, leaving, Mr. Obama, who had fired General Flynn as the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, told President Trump that he would have profound concerns about Mr. Flynn becoming a top national security aide. It goes on to say Flynn's name came up during the broader discussion about personnel issues, and Mr. Obama's concerns about Mr. Flynn were largely about his mismanagement, and he goes on about warning Trump about Flynn. Here is Sean Spicer asked that question today.
It's true that President Obama made it known that he wasn't exactly a fan of General Flynn's, which is frankly shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, that given that General Flynn had worked for President Obama, was an outspoken critic of President Obama's shortcomings. If President Obama was truly concerned about General Flynn, why didn't he suspend General Flynn's security clearance, which they had just reapproved months earlier? Additionally, why did the Obama administration let Flynn go to Russia for a paid speaking engagement?
Yeah.
Well, certainly, I think what you're seeing is the White House try to push back on the narrative that the Obama administration gave them much of a heads up, that they thought Flynn wasn't going to be a good actor for them. I think we saw this with Sean Spicer. We also saw it with what Donald Trump was trying to tweet to send some signals to Senate Republicans about what he wanted to hear from them.
Yeah, and those tweets, General Flynn was given the highest security clearance by the Obama administration, but the fake news seldom likes talking about that. And then the president tweeting, ask Sally Yates under oath if she knows how classified information got into the newspapers, soon after she explained it to White House counsel. Mercedes, those questions were asked.
That's right.
And they said they didn't know.
Well, and they didn't know, and I think that one of the things they kept going back to is the fact, well, we got to go into a classified setting in order to have these sorts of discussions. But there's multiple storylines going on during this testimony, one being the Republicans honing in on the leaks of the classified information, also the executive order where Yates basically said that she didn't support the executive order. She thought it was unlawful. And then the Democrats, on the other hand, still probing on the fact of are there Russian ties between the Trump campaign officials and the Russians, basically. So I think that for Yates in general, that storyline of the leaks of who got that information, I think Lindsey Graham really honed in on it to say, you know, Clapper, that there's very few people who have access to this information, and he wants to get down to the bottom of this.
Yeah, and the unmasking of the names. There is a paper trail someplace at the NSA of who ordered that.
Look, there are several storylines, and these hours and hours of hearing advanced. Not one of them. We learned nothing today that we didn't know yesterday. There's a classic case of sort of a video event that lives only to dramatize things, but not to add to our fund of knowledge. And we live in an age where that can sometimes work. You know, the video of the United Airlines guy, if it hadn't been on video, we never would have talked about it. But because it was dramatized, it became a huge event. There is nothing that was said today that we didn't already know. The only result of these hours of hearing is that Sally Yates is now a Democratic star, and she needs to pick a state and run for the Senate. She is a rising candidate for the future. And her answer on the question, why did you resign and all that, was exactly right. It would be nice if we had a tradition in our government where people resign on principle. You could say it was a cheap shot. She was leaving 3 days later anyway. But it's refreshing. I don't think since Cyrus Vance and the Iran raid in 1979, have we had a high official who resigns. And then the administration was right to fire her. If you can't carry out the president's orders, you're gone. So everything was right on both sides. But the bottom line is we learned zero.
If the Washington Post had not come out with that story, this is a question I asked Bret earlier, is Michael Flynn still National Security Advisor today?
No, because he would have screwed up on something else between then and now, and that's the only reason.
Steve?
Look, on the question of President Obama saying that he warned President Trump about Mike Flynn, that's a bit disingenuous from President Obama. Mike Flynn was one of President Obama's harshest critics, particularly as it relates to Islamic radicalism, Al-Qaeda, the growth of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And Mike Flynn was 100% right about that. Whatever you think about what he did here, whatever you think about his explanation since, he was right about that. He was sounding the alarms. This was at a time when President Obama was saying that Al-Qaeda was on the run. They weren't on the run, and Mike Flynn was right about that. Having said that, the idea that Sean Spicer would say, well, you know, the Obama administration should have pulled Mike Flynn's clearances. Can you imagine how the Trump campaign would have responded if the Obama administration had pulled his clearances as he's campaigning for Donald Trump?
The Trump campaign should have worried about vetting Michael Flynn, doing that, having that be a primary job, so they would have avoided this headache that now they have. But I do think one of the questions that has been raised during the testimony, and I think it's worth pursuing, is why did the Trump administration keep Flynn on from that January 26th to the February, the 18 days, when they had this information and Flynn was still attending classified briefings and in these calls with Senator Flynn. I think that's critical.
Posited that perhaps it's because he was concerned about other people and other communications. And he just threw that out there in the hearing, saying this is maybe one of the reasons. And nobody answered, said, I have no answer for you, but he just kind of threw it out there. So clearly that's the thinking of where the Democrats are in their head. I want to play this soundbite. This is from Meet the Press, and Senator Lindsey Graham Anna asked about this, whether Clapper sticks by it.
We did not include any evidence in our report, and I say our, that's NSA, FBI, and CIA with my office, the Director of National Intelligence, that had any reflection of collusion between members of the Trump campaign and the Russians. There was no evidence of that included in our report.
I understand that, but does it exist?
Not to my knowledge.
Is that still accurate?
It is.
My answer to that question would require me to reveal classified information. I think that Director Clapper also said that he was unaware of the FBI counterintelligence investigation.
So, I mean, just putting that all together for the audience, you have this report that is said to be signed off by the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, not every intelligence, but essentially the Director of National Intelligence is giving this report and coming to the conclusion that they didn't have evidence of collusion. Sally Yates is saying, I can't talk about it because there was an ongoing investigation that he didn't know about.
Right. I mean, that's the question here, right? I mean, Clapper stood by that testimony saying, to the best of his knowledge again today, that that wasn't happening. But it appears that there was obviously an investigation happening that, you know, for whatever reason, people beneath him weren't giving him that information.
So is it because it was in its infancy? It just didn't make it into the report? I mean, it seems like a big disconnect here. And now we are well into this administration, and we still don't have evidence of collusion. It's not there yet.
Well, there, yeah.
But Democrats continue to say that it's there, essentially.
Of course. What else do they have? You know, when you say it's not there yet, that assumes it's going to come out. What's going to come out? I don't even understand what collusion means. What does it mean?
Knowing when the WikiLeaks was going to be released, orchestrating the timing of the Access Hollywood tape comes out, and then the emails are released the same day.
If that's what was going on, there'd be so many parties involved. The idea that we would have no evidence of it right now wouldn't have been leaked to any of the news organizations is highly improbable. And I think it's just the Democrats pursuing a conspiracy theory. When I heard the senator from Minnesota, Franken, talking about his tremendously elaborate theory, I was thinking, who gave him the tinfoil hat? I mean, that's so way out there. It was a great theory. It would make a good novel. But show me any evidence. What you've got, people who are involved with Russians, and you get the Russians involved in the election without a shred of evidence connecting them. So until you get it, it's a concoction by the Democrats. I'm open to evidence. Show it to me.
Just moments ago, the president tweeted, Sally Yates made the fake media extremely unhappy today. She said nothing but old news. So we will wrap up this panel on that. Next up, the return of Barack Obama and the next steps on repealing and replacing Obamacare.